Greetings, class. This time we'll be addressing the question, why are wars fought? And I want to offer a couple of different ways to think about it. Again, lots of times we're not going to answer the questions here. Lots of times you already know the answers. So in these cases, it's not pretending that I'm smarter than you, because we all know that fails as a strategy, and we've talked about it. But the thinking about different frameworks helps us to think about wars in different ways and helps us to understand peace in different ways. So, one of the strategies that I want to employ here is looking at war as a method for problem solving. You know, that it's an interest based, a need based, a want based process, and that people fight because they believe that it's a good strategy for delivering the outcomes that they want. Um, and another part of this is going to be a continuation of the ideology of um, Karl von Clausewitz, who has been attributed with a quote that's not the best translation, but I don't know what the best translation would be, but of saying that war is diplomacy by other means. Or in other cases, it's translated as war is a continuation of policy. Um, and so the idea here is that when we think about wars in some sort of kind of moralistic positioning, just war theory, and so forth, and that the idea would be that there are moral, reasonable, and just causes for which fighting would be permissible. This basically is the part where it's war is when all other alternatives have been exhausted, which I would argue actually is never the case. Even if you say that we're not very creative, one can always think of other alternatives and so forth. But I think going through this kind of framework and then the depth of the implications, it really gets to the crucial part in answering why are wars fought. So again, so starting with this framework, the broad picture of conflict and problem solving, I lay out that if we are low on our interests and low on the interests of the other, then we become conflict avoidant. We don't pursue what we want. We don't actively engage in what someone else wants. If we're high in the interests of the other and we're not worrying a whole lot about ourselves, we become very accommodating. And I lay out different cases where that might be useful, right? In my not asked for dating advice, I say that if you're accommodating on a first date, that might encourage your ability to get a second date. Or if your parents come to visit, and they've been supporting you in college or something, showing them a nice time and taking them out to the restaurants they want to might be just a better strategy, as opposed to saying like, we're getting what I'm in the mood for, when that's not what the parents want. Conversely, when we're high on our interests and low on the interests of the other, we become very competitive, like yes, what I want, me. Right? We compete. And war is going to be up here. It's going to be in that competitive part of this terrain. Coercive even, right? That we're not sometimes, like just competing, but we're fighting for, we're killing for, we're forcing our way, right? If we're high on both, right, that's the collaborative point, right? We won't stop until all of our needs get met and all of the needs of the other get met. And somewhere in the middle, we talk about compromise, right? We give up some of our wants for satisfying the needs of the other. And if we both give a little, then we both get a little, and we think that that's a good way to do it. And so collaboration would take more work, but everybody gets all of what they want. Sometimes we don't have as much opportunity to put in the work, and compromise makes just as much sense, right? And when we think about these 5 different modes, right, conflict avoidance sometimes gets thought about as picking your battles, right? Right, because it takes energy to fight, it takes energy to argue, and if it's just not worth it, or if the risks are too high, we don't engage in it. And we could think about accommodation relating to our kind of sense of war in terms of this attribution to Abraham Lincoln of, we defeat our enemies when we make friends out of them. You know, you have an adversary, and if you can turn your adversary to an ally instead of having to kill them, right? That's kind of this accommodation thing. I mean, it's probably not exactly what Lincoln meant when he was talking about it that way. He was talking about it more strategically. But if somebody's upset with me, and it looks like it's going to be like just a drawn out argument, fight, debate, or maybe they're angry at me over something that's not that big of a deal to me. I mean, it could be for all sorts of strategic reasons, but somebody's upset with me and I have a chance to say, hey, just stop shouting. What's going on here? What can I do to make it right? If I give you what you want, are we cool here? And then the person's like, yeah, if you give me what I want, we're cool here. And then you just do it. Sometimes that's really a good strategy, because even though you might not feel like it's fair, you might save yourself a lot of time and frustration. Collaboration is something that I think is something to really be promoted in terms of situations where you want to have strong relationships, because learning how to work together is also something that's desirable. And compromise can prevent from getting to the big extremes. If I give a little bit to avoid a war, right? Accommodation might be like fully giving and they get everything they want and I don't get anything I want. But compromise means I get something, they get something. There's some chance for some face saving in there. Anyway, war means that avoiding didn't work, accommodating didn't work, compromise didn't work, collaboration didn't work. We have failed. We have failed with our strategic opportunities to try to reach peaceful outcomes through those strategies. And now we've competed. We can say we've competed. We've tried to use our words to get what we want. We've tried to argue our point, and we have not been convincing. So now there's the only thing that's left is the extremely expensive, both economically and in terms of human lives, option of you won't give me what I want, so I'm going to kill you and I'm going to take it from you. Why are wars fought, right? Wars are fought because we believe that we have a significant reason to desire something, right? It could be symbolic, it could be spiritual, it could be an interest, it could be economic, it could be a million different things, right? But you've got something that we want, and we're not taking no for an answer. Wars are fought because presumably things are really important, and the other stuff hasn't worked. Sometimes it turns out it hasn't worked because it hasn't been tried. Sometimes it turns out it hasn't worked because we have incompetent leadership. Right? There's a lot of different ways that we can get to failure. But wars are fought because other strategies have failed. And this is where the Clausewitz comes in, right? We're leveraging our positions through our show of force, our willingness to do damage, to kill in the pursuit of our ends. Some people will say that wars must be fought when we have to defend ourselves. Right? Wars are fought because somebody is trying to take from you what you are not in a position to give up. Survival is at stake. Wars are fought when the things that are happening in the world are too extreme to delay. That genocidal activities are taking place and there's no room for conversation. This is something that's contagious in our modern world. I use the example of the United Nations regularly. The League of Nations failed to prevent World War I, and it fell apart. And so, we didn't have a League of Nations. It formed in the wake of World War I. It failed to prevent World War II. In the wake of World War II, the United Nations came together as an opportunity to be an improvement over the League of Nations. The idea was that we were stronger united, and that while individual countries had not done a good job of regulating the international system and preventing global catastrophe, but as a group, as a collective, we could better police for the causes and underlying conditions that lead to war. So in high school, right, it's 1994, and I'm in the midst of, all of the different things that are going on as a teenager would. And, right, there's things like the singer of my favorite band at the time, Nirvana, commit suicide. Anyway, 1994 also was the experience of the Rwandan genocide. And there were things like journalists putting their lives on the line to get footage of the genocide taking place. And when it was broadcast to the world, which would have been assumed, right? If you see what's happening, then you have to do something. But the world didn't intervene in Rwanda because they were afraid of another Mogadishu. And if you've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that's the event in Somalia that causes us to be afraid to get involved in Rwanda. A humanitarian operation, or at least perceived to have been a humanitarian operation by the people who were promoting it, failed, helicopter down, deaths, and it was just a big mess. And so out of fear for having another botched operation, or using the excuse of another botched operation as being what they wanted to avoid, no intervention to prevent, the hundreds of thousands of people dying every week. Machetes, right? Most of the deaths happen in a very close, personal, really violent fashion. People's bodies were hacked up. Anyway, 1994, Rwandan genocide, failure to act, United Nations, the world watched and did nothing, and then they came up with what they called the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, which gets to the other part, that wars would not be fought over what happens within a country's borders, because sovereignty is seen as something that's so valuable. Right? If U.S. wants to do stuff to U.S. citizens inside of its own borders, the rest of the world should mind its own business. So the responsibility to protect says that the world has a responsibility to intervene when a state's not taking responsibility for its citizens, right? And that also fails, right? We saw in Syria, 8 years ago, 5,000 innocent civilians being killed every month. And so the Security Council's made up of specific actors, and Russia's able to veto any UN intervention into saving life in Syria. It's horrible, truly horrible. It's appalling. If there's any complaints to be made, we can usually figure out some pretty good sources. And in that one, the U.S. was trying to get involved and couldn't leverage enough force to overrule the Soviet-Russian veto. So there's a distinction, again, history. Why would you say this or that about failed states? But lots of the ideas about the Russian veto are presented as relics from the failed communist enterprise. World War II set the stage for global polarity of democracy versus communism. And with these kind of two sets of factions, we avoided large wars by having lots of small proxy wars. Proxy wars are the idea that we'll fight over something in a small and symbolic way to represent like what we think, right? What we think's important. Again, it's like the competitive, but like competitive diet or competitive light. Like U.S. doesn't fight the Soviet Union. USA versus USSR is not happening. It's in Afghanistan, USA and USSR supporting and fighting and arming and advancing troops, um, having pawns in the greater competition. So why would that happen, right? Like, why would we get involved in supporting the side in another state, and why would the USSR get involved in supporting a different side in a different state so that they could fight against each other? Again, it's all about control and stabilization and regions and what do we think is going to put us in the best position to get what we want, right? Sometimes it's not needs, right? People do fight. We do have wars over resources and so forth because survival is important. But sometimes it's the interest. Oil pipelines, that's a great way to make money, right? And so we'll fight a war in order to protect our economic ambitions and so forth. And when we ask for things, right, consent is not always given, right? States don't always want more U.S. military bases or more U.S. business. Sometimes they want to make their own money or they don't like the deal that they're being offered, right? So we fight for a lot of different things and we fight for a lot of different reasons. And it comes out in different ways. So if you think about it as the pursuit of ambition, wars are fought as a way of generating desirable outcomes. That's a framework. I think it's a failed framework. I think it's a failed framework because we show over and over and over and over and over, right, that even the U.S. military, which is huge, our U.S. military is more successful in its non-combat operations. It has a better success rate when we don't actually blow people up. Something worth considering. But in the other sense, we can frame this in terms of war means that we have failed, right? If we're dropping bombs, that means that our attempts to have reasonable dialogue and discussion, to try to have managed settlements and reasonable agreements that might include collaboration or compromise, have failed, right? War is failure. It's not a popular thing. You'll never hear a politician say that fighting wars makes us weak. We don't like to talk about it that way, but I like to talk about it that way. When we drop bombs, it means that the other efforts, if we reach agreements in writing or verbally, especially when we have enforcement clauses, that is so much more secure than anything that's generated by a bomb being dropped. Because as soon as people rearm or as soon as they rebuild, the conditions go back to what they had been. Anyway, that's why wars are fought. Hope you like my non-answer. I'll see you guys on the next question.